Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 14th of February. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm with CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, nuclear threat level rising, top Russians think war has already begun, the age of entitlement is over, preach the pigs at the public trough, and car industry post-mortem. What is real economic growth? First, nuclear threat level rising. Top Russians think war has already begun. Craig, in a minute we're going to play the viewers a video that's been produced by our associates in the United States who work with Lyndon LaRouche, who've done most of the work warning the West about the implications of what our allies' policies in Ukraine are leading to, right? Which is an actual war that, if it starts, would rapidly escalate into a nuclear exchange. And the reason why it would be like that, of course, is because our side isn't taking seriously how determined the Russians would be to defend themselves, right? And so they're thinking that we can meddle around like we're doing there, in a pretty ugly way, supporting fascists, actual fascists, and there's not going to be any consequences. Well, of course, there are going to be any consequences. So this video summarises it and let people watch that. But I want to just quote a retired general whose name's Leonid Ivashov from the 10th of February, so it's just a few days ago. And he is the former foreign relations head of the Russian Ministry of Defense and the current president of the Academy of Geopolitical Studies. And this is what he said, quote, "I assume that the foreign ministry understands that we are at war and that wars have their laws. After the information war," i.e. what he means by that is the media propaganda we're getting about these, that is painting these neo-Nazis in Ukraine as a democracy movement, right? So after the information war, they are preparing a land and sea war in Ukraine. Kerry and Obama are encouraging in Kiev what they harshly repress in their country. They wouldn't tolerate this in their own country. European leaders break up unauthorised demonstrations with hoses, throw demonstrators in jail, and he's talking about putting down the anti-austerity protests in Greece and those places, right? So that's what is happening in Europe. But in the Ukraine case, they do the exact opposite, and on top of that, they threaten Russia. Logically, this is part of information warfare. Keep in mind that under the cover of information commotion, US ships are entering the Black Sea, that is near Ukraine. They are sending Marines, and they have also begun to deploy more tanks in Europe. After the information war, they are preparing for an operation by land and sea, possibly also by air. The scenario could be the following: drive Ukraine to the breaking point, blame Yanukovych, the president of Ukraine, and Russia for everything, to then say that NATO can't simply sit by as a mere spectator, and then send its troops in to return order, which is the formula followed in Libya and Syria, etc. They wouldn't do in Syria. Back to the President General, then a transitional government would be formed, as happened in Iraq and Kosovo, and NATO would take control of everything. Historical experience shows that we have lived through similar situations, but before they will need to justify the aggression with information warfare. That's the end of the quote. So this is, when a general, I mean, imagine, Craig, if Peter Cosgrove, retired general, said to the Australian people, we are at war, right? Just because he's not in the army anymore or in the government, you would take that very, very seriously. This particular general is part of a group, like a think tank in Russia, which is very influential in the government, right? So what he's saying is trying to give the West the sense of the seriousness they have to look at this with.
I think the complicity of the Western media is incredible, Robbie, because in the US, the fact that you have a Nazi fascist opposition to the government, the elected government, the democratic elected government, where 350 former fighters with the Free Syrian Army have come in onto the streets of Ukraine.
And there's apparently 12,000 armed neo-Nazis in total now.
None of this is being reported that most people that are watching this program would have no idea about this, shows you the nature of the press when you come into periods of war.
Yep.
That in fact the first thing to die is the truth.
And also, Craig, just before we go to the video, just one thing I think we need to make clear to people is that the method that they're using is, because what they want to do is topple Ukraine, and then you have Ukraine becomes part of the EU, and then Russia's enemies are right up to their border, right? And so what they're doing exactly what they did in Libya and Syria, which is that you get they get protests going in Ukraine, and then they start treating the protesters as if they are the legitimate government. And we Australian people are told, oh, yeah, the Ukrainian government's bad, but we're working with the alternative government. When there's no mass popular support for it, the current government was voted in a landslide, right? But it's just to give us create this charade by which they can then practice their regime change. But what they're up against, of course, is a government in Russia that is fiercely sovereign, and they will not tolerate where this is going. And that is why it's our side that's poking the bear, and it's the bears. What they want to do is get the bear to react, so that then our side can justify a nuclear assault.
Just quickly, Robbie, before we throw to an LPAC video that goes through this in more detail, the issue here is this issue of national sovereignty, that Russia will not allow their sovereignty to be impeached by having NATO forces right up to their doorstep. They've made that very, very clear in many public forums. Secondly, you have China. China's a sovereign nation. This last week you've seen sovereign exercises on the high seas. China is a major force now. We've published a lot of material about this, particularly in our last series of New Citizens. We're about to go to press again almost immediately on this issue. So I encourage people to call in for our material.
Okay, so let's now watch this this video by the LaRouche Political Action Committee that explains the situation in Russia and Ukraine right now.
LaRouche PAC and Executive Intelligence Review have just published an exclusive memo from a group of influentials tied to the Russian government, the Izborsk Club, warning of the strategic consequences of continued agitation in Ukraine. They warn that Ukraine is being transformed into a new hotspot for Europe and the entire world, and into a hotbed of instability and chaos on Russia's borders. The strategic significance of Ukraine today is that the crisis there threatens to become the trigger for the onset of a thermonuclear confrontation between Russia and the United States. Lyndon LaRouche warned on February 3rd that as long as the U.S. continues its current policy direction, the world is threatened with thermonuclear war in the coming month.
What I've been saying since January 1st is that we're now in a countdown toward a thermonuclear war. And what we're in now is just provocations against Russia to try to set up a situation which will trigger a Russian response of the type they want, and then they will immediately launch thermonuclear war. Now, my time scale was saying, well, by the 1st of March, we are already at that time, if not earlier, we are on the verge of actual thermonuclear mutual extermination.
The two statements, translated by EIR and LaRouche PAC over the past 48 hours, show that despite what is being propagated in the Western media, Russia is on high alert. In the memo by the Izborsk Club, whose members include presidential advisor Sergei Glaziev and retired General Leonid Ivashov, the authors warn first that Ukraine faces the risk of going fascist, with the Western support given to an explicitly neo-Nazi faction of the Euromaidan. That support violates the 1994 U.S., Russia, Ukraine, UK treaty. According to the Izborsk memo, if that 1994 treaty is violated because one of the parties refuses to come to the table, then the situation will escalate and should be handled like the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, with direct U.S.-Russian bilateral negotiations. When Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov raised the specter of world war at the annual Fecunda Security Conference in early February, Western sources accused Russia of making bellicose statements. However, the memo from the Izborsk Club outlines what Russia perceives as direct threats to its security and territorial integrity. These are threats that have never even been acknowledged by the sources calling Russia's assessment bellicose. Consider the military threat of a creeping coup in Ukraine. The Russian armed forces will be forced out of Crimea and the Black Sea port of Sevastopol. Ukraine and NATO will develop an expanding partnership leading to the appearance of US and NATO bases in Ukraine and Crimea. The unrest will open up the establishment in eastern Ukraine of bases for training terrorists to operate not only in the Caucasus, but in Siberia and the Volga Basin. Finally, the techniques of the Euromaidan will be extended into major Russian cities, especially those with existing ethnic tensions. Despite these obvious threats, the view from Washington, D.C. political circles remains bleak, with congressmen allowing their votes to be used for a larger, very dangerous geopolitical game. On Tuesday, February 11th, 381 members of Congress voted for H-Res 447, authorizing support for the openly fascist opposition forces in Ukraine. In the other exclusive document translated from Russian by EIR, General Leonid Ivashov describes exactly how this game is being played. Officials of the European Union and the U.S. executive branch present everything backwards from reality. It is one of the formulas which Nazi propaganda employed most successfully. They accuse the party that is defending itself of aggression. What we are seeing in Ukraine and in Syria is a Western project, a new kind of war. In both places, you see a clear anti-Russian approach, and as is well known, wars today begin with psychological and information warfare operations. After the information war, they are preparing a land and sea in Ukraine. Keep in mind that under the cover of information commotion, U.S. ships are entering the Black Sea, that is, near Ukraine. They are sending Marines, and they have also begun to deploy more tanks in Europe. After the information war, they are preparing for an operation by land and sea, possibly also by air. General Ivashov concludes, "I assume that the Foreign Ministry understands that we are at war." We present this information here because these are the provocations that lead to world war. There is an active war faction inside the United States, which is using the executive branch and much of the Congress. If the intention is to prevent war, the way to do that is to remove Barack Obama from office. Even if citizens of the United States refuse to believe we are on the path to world war, that is a perception in Russia. And when your potential enemy believes you are at war, you are at war.
Welcome back to the CEC Report. Age of entitlement is over. Preach the pigs at the public trough. So, Craig, this is actually a serious issue because this week, Australia, as of now, knows we will no longer manufacture cars in Australia. And I think we've manufactured cars for something like 100 years. And
we actually started manufacturing them when Ben Chifley brought the hold on line.
No, I looked that up. That was the Australian designed and made car. We were making cars. We were bringing in other countries' designs and putting them together here and whatever. So we've been doing cars for a lot longer than that. But from Ben Chifley, you're right, in 1948 to today, we became a major car manufacturer.
From design to production to
exactly.
completion. Yeah.
It was something we've been very proud of that whole time. So that's now over. And of course, we know it's very serious. We're going to talk about that more in the next segment. But think about the logic behind the people that have allowed this to happen. Now, we're not blaming Abbott and hockey for all of it because this is 30 years of free trade, which the Labor Party is just as complicit in it. So Bill Shorten can cry his crocodile tears all he's like, but he's a free trade trader as well. So it's not about that. But when hockey and Abbott have been confronted with this issue, their response has been to very callously say there will be no corporate welfare. Therefore, if it can't stand on its own 2 feet, they've got to go. And incidentally, Craig, they include in corporate welfare tariffs. And so they come up with this figure that the car industry in the last decade or whatever has had $30 billion in support. But that includes tariffs which
Huh?
is just rubbish.
Rubbish. I mean, if you had a 30% tariff right now, Robbie, brought in tomorrow, 30%, maybe 50%, I don't care. What would that do to the car industry?
It would give it a
Turn
huge boost.
Exactly. So what we're talking about is an ideological argument here that 50,000 jobs in the high-tech car manufacturing industry, from the components, the suppliers, the whole work, is not worth saving.
Yeah.
Why not? And if goes back to this argument that Australia should only be basically a mining, exporting country.
Exactly. So anyway, then Joe Hockey's been running around saying the age of entitlement is over. Now, Craig, in the last few weeks...
Except for bankers, Robbie, let's be
Well, that's
clear.
where we're about to head to. In the last few weeks, we've kept talking about an organisation called the Centre for Independent Studies. And what that is, it's a think tank in Sydney where Joe Hockey and Tony Abbott go and give their speeches, and Liberal politicians and Labor politicians have done it for 30 years. And this is the bastion of free trade ideas in Australia, right? But this group and the government, at the same time as they're saying slash welfare for ordinary people, cut pensions, don't let the dole raise to be able to meet the cost of living or anything like that. People have got to be personally responsible, etc. No corporate welfare. The same people are saying that. They are currently planning the biggest fire sale of public assets probably in history that you can imagine, and a raft of new public infrastructure called public-private partnerships, so that private companies can make money. And Craig, the funniest thing was Hockey's been talking about this privatisations, and he actually the way he put it, he says, everyone must do the heavy lifting and big business must help with the heavy lifting by buying these assets. I mean, what are we thinking about here? We're thinking about giving them assets that have been built up over generations through public investment. We're going to put a price tag on it and sell it to them so that they can get a guaranteed revenue stream from it. And Joe Hockey says that's heavy lifting for them, right? This is a joke. And I want to give you one example. And we talked about this guy last week, Tony Shepherd. Tony Shepherd is the head of the National Commission of Audit. So they're going to hand down a report soon that says, yeah, government's lived beyond its means, we're in too much debt, we've got to privatise everything, right? Well, he's an expert in PPPs, Tony Shepherd. In fact, he worked out the first public-private partnership with the New South Wales government in 1992 or something, and it was the Sydney Harbour Tunnel. Mm-hmm. But guess what? The Sydney Harbour Tunnel isn't working. It's not raising the money it needs to raise to be profitable. The Sydney Harbour Bridge, which is above the tunnel, Craig, is debt-free. Mm. It was a public project, it's a government-owned, and it's debt-free, but there's a toll on it. Do you know where the toll goes that the people who use the Sydney Harbour Bridge pay?
Well, I know where it goes to pay for the tunnel.
It goes to pay the private investors who own the tunnel. Yeah. Because when they did the deal for that tunnel, they got a concession from the government that guaranteed them their revenue.
But that's the way all these projects work, Robbie.
That is exactly. It's the public that carries the risk. It's the private sector that get the profits. And these people turn around and say to a car industry that actually produces something, no corporate welfare. I'll give you another example, the Future Fund. The Future Fund was 1/3 of the sale of Telstra and a couple of years of tax surpluses, which means money that the public paid in tax, they've put into a $90 billion fund. And where does that fund go? It gets put into huge private corporations on the stock market, bolstering them through their share return. Meanwhile, SPC says if we could have $25 million, we could keep going. Oh, no, we're not going to borrow money to put $25 million into CEC. So Craig,
SPC. I'd like 25 million.
CEC, sorry, SPC.
SPC's fine.
So Craig, it occurred to me, this is like the pigs in Animal Farm, where if you know the Animal Farm, George Orwell's Animal Farm, it was a polemic against communism, but it's true for capitalism as well. And they used to say all animals are created equal, but some are more equal than others. And isn't that what we're looking at?
Robbie, go back. Why did Ben Chifley want a car industry? Because he wanted to move Australia out of from riding off the ship's back and being a mining country to actually having advanced manufacturing sector.
He had a national interest.
He had a national interest and the tendency to develop the manufacturing sector. Today, the intention is not to have that, and what you're seeing is the unravelling of 50, 60, 70 years of built-up assets, right, both in the manufacturing sector but also in infrastructure.
And the looting of Australia. We're going to take a break now, and we're going to continue talking about the car industry when we come back. Welcome back to the CEC Report. And on this continuing theme on the car industry post-mortem, what is real economic growth? And so, Craig, before the break, we're talking about the fact that the same government that is, about to give, banks that invest in infrastructure projects, a guaranteed license to print money through public-private partnerships, etc. They won't lift a finger to assist the car industry. And of course now, as a result, we do not have a car industry anymore. But some economists, Craig, are saying that the closure of the car industry, which is at least 50,000 jobs and some more, they go, oh no, that won't put the economy into any kind of recession. And those people, because the government reports that they're creating jobs every month or whatever, those 50,000 workers will get the new jobs that are created. So it raises the question, how do these people who think this way, how do they measure the economy?
I want to just draw an analogy, Robbie. 35 years ago, car washes were almost non-existent.
True.
They were the domain of the scout groups that on a Saturday morning you take your car down there as a charity to get your car washed.
Yourself.
Right, because in fact, people had the time, they had the leisure, they had the capacity to spend their time washing their cars. Today, car washes are everywhere, right? Because people don't have the time. They're working 2, sometimes 3 jobs in order to be able to support the economy. So what you're seeing is when you measure an economy, you measure it actually by the amount of real leisure. This is a physical principle of economy, one of the principles of physical economy, that it's the amount of leisure that you have within an economy that is then used to develop the capacity of the individual.
Leisure after people have met their needs. That's the thing.
That's the point. Then if you look at today, you look at what it would take to buy a home, you've already got 2 people working full time, right, in order to be able to fund the mortgages these days. So when we look at the economy overall, we say, well, we're really wealthy, we're really well off. Then you see the entire slab of the economy, like the car manufacturing industry, disappear. You know that we're actually not if you're looking at an economy from a physical economic point of view.
And because there's a big difference between productive jobs and
those productive jobs, those high-paying jobs within that sector, and there's all sorts of discussion about how the car industry is overpaying their workers. If you've got a capacity for a single income earning family to meet their needs, then you have the capacity to support the community and the economy in a much more productive way than having everyone so ragged that they don't even get time to wash their cars these days. Now this is actually a degeneration of the economy. It's not, people say, oh, it's just the way things are. But when you go back and you look at what the economy was with these high-paying productive jobs, and Australia had one of the most productive economies in the world coming out of the war, because of the policies during the war, of this commitment to physical economic development, because of the commitment to the manufacturing sector, we actually produced things with these high-paying jobs. Then you look at, then we'll just jump over to SPC right now, 3,000 jobs there, right? 500 jobs just in the cannery alone. What would that mean to lose those jobs, right? It means that you've got 500 families or family members now unable to support their income, their lifestyles, to actually live, right? And that's what you're actually funding. You're funding the ability for us to produce real things, not financial speculation, not the ability to wash our cars, but to actually produce something at the end of the day. So there's a fundamental difference between physical economy.
Which, after all, we're still eating canned fruit, we're still buying cars. So we do need those things, but we're funding our ability to produce them ourselves.
That's right. And I think there's a lot more we can say, and we have said a lot on this in the past. There's so much our country can do that literally we are being looted blind.
All right. Well, thanks for that, Craig. As usual, we've run out of time, so thanks for tuning in. Tune in next week for more.